Hi, this is Jason T. Ingram, and this is the continuation of my series about Christianity and insanity. It's been weighing on my heart for a long time. Why the T is there's a Christian songwriter named Jason Ingram. In the 90s, he had the Jason Ingram Band, and when I was involved in praise and worship music, we even saw his CDs up in Anchorage. And occasionally somebody would be like, "You're not the Jason Ingram I saw in the Christian bookstore." And I'd be like, "No," and he kind of looked like me a little bit. So I put the T in there, and it sounds kind of pretentious. And I also like the reference of one of my favorite 80s movies I grew up with called Romancing the Stone. And she asked Jack T. Colton what the T stand for, and he said, trustworthy. And so, having grown up in the 80s and a hypersexualized culture, I became averted. I had an aversion towards sexuality, especially towards the gay community, because the gay community was really starting to become an influence, especially in the art world and the kind of church I went to, the kind of school that I went to. And it was a huge turnoff for me because it seemed like in order to be a part of the gay community and come out of the closet, you really had to conform to a lot of stuff. And I found that I had to conform to a nonconformist culture. I grew up and I dressed up as a punk hippie. People didn't know what I was. Like, I think people didn't beat me up because they're like, "Hey, let's beat up that punk. Let's beat up that hippie." And wait a minute, what is he? And I was an outcast from educated, creative culture. I didn't talk like them. I didn't act like them. I found that they are not very affirming towards disabled people unless they can control them, or unless that, disabled person, like when I mean control them, if they're this sort of like this, for lack of a better term, like a spotted owl or a baby seal or something. Oh, we love this person. We give them money. We make them famous, and we kind of put them on a pedestal, but we don't treat that person as equal. And I've seen that especially with a lot of low functioning disabled people. And I was sort of in that moderate functioning type thing where I was able to survive on my own to a certain extent. And I didn't end up needing 24/7 care. And I'm rarely in a position where I have to have 24/7 care. So I found what's interesting, that there are disabled people who are treated as equal in the world of arts and entertainment amongst educated progressives, especially urban West Coast areas. And I found that unless I had a recognized position with power and popularity and privilege and all those P's that I can't stand when it comes to my culture, that they won't treat you as an equal. And I was an outcast in the mid-90s in Portland, which I consider the buckle of the unchurched belt. And having gone to two Bible schools in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we called that the buckle of the Bible Belt. And it's true. You have the worst sinners you could ever picture, and they still have a lot of Bible influence in their life. They have the same language. They have the same world that's painted. And I find the secular right very interesting, because as much as they hate church, they still have this, I don't know if it's the fear of God or they're just afraid that they're going to be judged. And for some reason, they've realized that there's a life that they should be living that's impossible for them to live, and they still live with this guilt, and they try to work it out in their heads. So Bible influence cultures can be really dangerous and can create monsters. And I talked a little bit in my last one about sexual predators. And I tell you, when it comes to monsters, these men act like non-humans, doing inhumane things, and actually creating people, especially children, creating other abusers and other monsters, and creating a lot of crazy for a lot of people, because that kind of trauma is one of the hardest things to heal from, especially when they're lured into it. So why are churches so vulnerable to sexual predators? Well, it's not just because they have access to them and they trust these people, and these men that are in charge have this sort of perceived power. And I've been in places of leadership, and I've seen the kind of energy that people give me when they perceive me as having some type of connection to God that they don't have, or having some type of power, or even something that's sort of this superhuman blessed thing. And I've perceived leaders that way too, until I get to know them, until I realize that they have a lot of crazy in their life and in their family. In fact, Liardon, speaking of compartmentalization, and somebody who's got an interesting history of his sexuality and living a chaste life, so to speak, is one of the most fascinating figures. If you look up Liardon, Roberts, like Oral Roberts, interesting life, studying a lot of the supernatural and a lot of church leaders over about almost a 200-year period. And he had a sermon when he was younger, because he got around a lot of ministers that really opened up to him when he was young, and he demonstrated an incredible amount of spiritual power. And people respected him. When he was like 21 years of age, he was doing the work that guys that spent 40 years trying to do. Because he just brought this thing down to a science, but he saw there was a lot of crazy going on. And he had a sermon called Midnight Insanity. And he said there's so many people, even preachers, who are just up in the middle of the night and they just lose their mind. And they start talking about it to people, and they're so ashamed. It's like, what's going on here? I'm praying all the time. I'm reading the Bible. I'm doing all this. And God's using me in the supernatural and using me to help people to find a reason to live and all this stuff. And they're just losing their fucking minds. And it is very common. In fact, there's so many clergy that are on antidepressants. There's so many clergy that are hooked on porn. That's a huge thing. When I was in Bible school in the late 90s, I mean, that became a huge issue. And I did not allow myself to have internet access for a long time. The whole time that I was 12 years as a Bible believer, I didn't have online access unless I went to a public place for that. And still, I had to identify as a sex addict, because even though I wasn't having sex with anybody until my 30s, and I didn't have any experience with men until my 30s, I had a couple of girlfriends in my teens, and I find it interesting that I was supposed to go into these anti-gay groups, and there wasn't any of that specifically in Anchorage, so it was the common belief that I was a sex addict because I had what they called same-sex attraction. And I had to go through sexual addiction programs. And get this, not including the pedophiles that I've actually lived with. And there's only two that I really know, and there was others that I suspected as preying on minors in various ways. But there were sexual predators in some of these groups that still had access to children, and they needed mental health care, and they were in these groups, and just hearing them talk was disgusting. And there was this idea that just as long as they're repentant and they're believing in the Bible, they're going that direction, that seems like, well, God can forgive everything, we're going to forgive everything too. And part of that belief system, part of that crazy, is that if somebody has 21 items in the express lane that says 20 items, that's a sin, because you're breaking the rules, you're setting a bad example. And then if you're raping a child, that's sin as well. And then if you drink a beer at dinner, to some circles, which is totally harmless to be drinking a beer unless you're a recovering alcoholic or it messes up some kind of medication reaction or something like that, or you're with an alcoholic and it causes them to stumble. Having a beer at dinner is one of the most harmless things that an adult can do. So what happens is they see something that's a little act of dishonesty, or maybe not returning the shopping cart to the cart corral. And people like Joyce Myers has to remind people to do that, to set a good example, because if not, it's a sin. And you worry it's a sin. And then what happens is that people, they do all these things all the time. They're on the freeway and they're in a hurry and they're in the fast lane with a bunch of cars and they're all going 70 and they don't think anything of it, even though they're breaking the law. But something in the back of their mind is saying, okay, this is a sin, it's wrong. And then they might confess that to their preacher or something, or they might confess that in a time of private prayer, saying, Lord, forgive me, I was disobeying the speed limit, and you said to obey those in authority over us. And you said not to worry, and I had worry and fear, and God forgive me about this. And then there was maybe some other things where they said, I watched a rated R movie and it wasn't The Passion of the Christ, which is rated R. And Lord, forgive me because I'm not supposed to do that in my church community and blah, blah, blah. And I saw some boobies on the big screen, something like that, which seeing nudity, there's nothing wrong with seeing nudity. There are people addicted to porn, and that's another thing. But as far as this, there are people that have a huge list of do's and don'ts. Like I said in the first part here, that there's this talk of it's a relationship, not a religion. And then you find out that it resembles a religion because there are do's and don'ts. And if you don't follow this list of do's and don'ts to a certain degree, then you will be an outcast in that community. And I know what it's like to be an outcast in the world of arts and entertainment and music and education. And that's a lot of hypocrisy for people that call themselves tolerant and affirming. And I get around people that have strong enough personalities to where they're not offended at some of my personality disorders and some of my lack of social skills and things like that. But I tell you what, though, I talk about certain things and it really freaks them out. And the reason why they're so freaked out about a lot of very harmless things is because they've compartmentalized themselves. Because what happens is that when you create a world for somebody and you reinforce that world with all the media and stuff in their culture and their community around them that is based on a biblical ideology, you're going to tell them that there's a lot of do's and don'ts that really make sense. Common sense. And then there's a lot of do's and don'ts that we've discovered through years of science and the changing of culture, that there are a lot of things that people used to say were wrong that aren't wrong. It's amazing. You go back, less than 100 years, and there are church people that think playing pool is a sin. And things like that were considered a sin. That it's rare to find a church that if you say, hey, we're going to go shoot some pool at my house, I've got a man cave in my basement, and we're going to sit around and we're going to drink Diet Coke and play pool, and then we're going to have a Bible study. That's not a huge deal for people. It's just a game with balls. But that used to represent something that people thought was a sin. And now we've got electric guitars in church. And 50 years ago, when Larry Norman made a Christian rock album, that was considered a sin. And now you see all these people with a lot of really old-fashioned ideas with electric guitars in their church. So it's funny how they have a list of do's and don'ts, but they're usually 2 to 3 generations behind, and then they eventually catch up, which is another form of crazy, because basically they're saying that, hey, there's right and wrong. Oh, but then again, my grandkids, they're going to have another set of rights and wrongs. And eventually they're going to start in these Bible-based fundamentalist Trinity broadcasting churches. It's going to take them generations, several generations, and they might not ever do this, but I think they're going to start having gay preachers and gay weddings like the liberal churches do. So it is kind of funny that there are rights and wrongs, but it'll be okay just as long as you wait long enough for the mainstream church to follow up and say, hey, this is okay now. And in the LDS church, which is very similar to Fundy's, they have these revelations where, okay, well, we're going to change our views about black people, and we're going to change our doctrine and stuff to make it fit more of the times. But everything else, we're going to be strict and traditional, and this is the way it is. And the biggest problem that I see and this is such a cliche when people talk about Bible believers, is of course hypocrisy. Now, I grew up with a lot of peace and love people. I grew up as a product of the sexual revolution. We had thought we won civil rights and gay rights and women's rights, and we did to a certain extent. And these peace and love people, whether it was passive aggressive or it had an intellectual characteristic to it, practice what I consider forms of bullying. And when you get around conservatives, they think liberals are bullies, and I kind of agree with them. It's just that, you know, we use our power and position and education. We like to undermine things. We like to play all these head games, and yeah, but we are bullies, and we like to point fingers at the Christians, the born-agains, whatever, that they're the haters because they're not tolerant and affirming of LGBTQ, sexual minorities, and spotted owls, and Palestinians, and all the people that we love. But it is funny, though, suffering the hypocrisy of the culture that I was raised in and saying that, well, these born-agains, they're the hypocrites. And then I look back at 12 years of heavy fundamentalist influence. And yeah, the hypocrisy was just as prevalent, probably more so, but it was so obvious. And today, here it is, it's Sunday. And this morning here at the RV park, I walked by a barbecue. There's a motorcycle group from around Oregon that came in, and Friday night we went over to the bar and got to hang out with some of these guys, and they're wonderful guys. I really enjoyed hanging out with. These were Trumpies and hardcore conservatives, and they were getting drunk and partying and listening to rock and roll and dancing and all this stuff. And I tell you, man, you know, people don't realize that conservatives are these just wild, badass party animals. You know, not necessarily the church people that I'm talking about, but more of the secular right, and even some folks that identify as born-again Christians, and they will in one breath say, oh, I'm really drunk, like Friday night. Sorry, I'm really, really drunk. And then talking about how it was so horrible that the government took prayer out of school, and the government's trying to take God out of school. And so that's such a form of crazy, is that here, they're demonstrating something that goes against their ideology, which is, you know, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. It's right there in their Bible, and it's rare to find a preacher that will advocate alcoholism, except that one guy in southern Arizona that had this healing ministry, who was drunk and praying for people, and whether they had real miracles or not, there was a lot of supernatural. He had a lot of following, and he's preaching the Bible. And that's one of Robert Liardon's story. In fact, if you look up at some of his God's generals, you'll find that you'll find a lot of crazy. William Brandon is a great example. There's a lot of crazy, and especially when he started to teach and all that kind of stuff. And there's another one of these, quote, God's generals that Mr. Liardon talks about, and a lot of people that are on the cutting edge of this postmodern Pentecostal charismatic river type stuff, the new voice of healing movement and this kind of stuff that I was marinated in my 20s, was a guy named Smith Wigglesworth. And it's interesting how much crazy there was in his life and his career. And it's so speculative of whether these healings and miracles and things actually took place or not. But I do believe there was something supernatural going on. And the fact that he was abusive. He was mean to people. He was mean to his wife. And I think he calmed down a bit later in his career. And another one we love to sing the praises of is an artist named Keith Green. And his story was so similar to mine. He grew up in a very progressive, intellectual type family. And he became a born-again Christian at around 19 or 20, which was about the same age that I was. And he was so driven. He was like a workaholic, and he just went go, go, go. And the guy was so brilliant. He was one of the best songwriters ever. He came out of this movement of, you know, the LA singer-songwriter scene that was going on, where we got the Eagles and Joni Mitchell and you name it. I mean, there's this explosion of wonderful songwriters. And Keith Green got into fundamentalism. And I've met people that have talked to him, and he was just so condemning when it came to, well, you know, aren't you concerned about their soul? You got to preach to them, and you got to pray for them, fast, and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And before he died at 28, though, he was really starting to understand grace. And it's just sad that we sing the praises of these people who really addicted to power, and they did have a lot of good influence, a lot of positive influence, a lot of contribution, and they probably did a lot of good works and things like that. It's just that people got hurt and they got so burned out. And I tell you, learning a lot about the Jesus movement was interesting, because we had these extremes. We had these hippies who survived the whole free love and group sex kind of stuff, and youth culture, and the drugs and alcohol. And a lot of them ended up, you know, with pregnancies they had to deal with, and they ended up having families, and they ended up not being able to maintain the hippie lifestyle. And there was a lot of harm done, and a lot of them came because they were vulnerable and they were hurting. And the new form of Christianity was like, hey, you could look and talk like a hippie. You could say, hey, man, praise the Lord. And they would carry these big family Bibles, and they were radical. I love the Jesus people. I love the history of the Jesus movement. I think it's fascinating, and there's a lot we can learn about it, too, about these extremes. And if there's one thing that I know that's very similar to having spent 12 years in Bible culture, and being raised 20 years in a reaction to Bible culture, is that these extremes were so crazy. There was so much crazy when there's this idea that, and we weren't raised being told if it feels good, do it, or anything goes, or whatever. No, we don't ever say that. But I think that Bible people are right when they look at progressive culture, and they call it moral relativism and situational ethics, and they love to put labels on liberals like us. And in some ways they're right, because we really don't have a common compass, so to speak, that we can say, hey, this is right and this is wrong. We have a whole bunch of rules and regulations, like, man, you got to recycle, and you know, you got to limit animal products and carbon footprint and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, we do have that kind of stuff. But as far as, like, you know, having an emphasis in my culture about having strong families and honesty and respect and honor, and we didn't emphasize that very much. It was all about freedom of expression. And so what happens is that when you go from that extreme, like I grew up in, with this total, like, freedom of expression, take off your clothes and shake your body and just freak out and paint rainbows on you and wear bells on your feet and just do the, I forget what they call it, the great, the deadhead dancing and stuff like that, which I love that shit. Coming from that world and then going into this strict Bible world is really interesting, because you see a lot of reformed people that were extreme in their behavior when it comes to, quote, being sinners. And then they transfer all that crazy and all that extreme behavior and all that escapism and all that self-medicating and self-harm that they were doing with drugs and alcohol and sex and all this kind of stuff, and getting diseases and getting overdoses. And then they go into the religious circle, and they're doing similar things and getting the similar effects, but they don't have the overdoses and they don't have the venereal diseases. And then you get guys that had an addiction to power and control, that were, let's say, they were they owned a strip club or something, and then they get saved. And then what happens is that they're doing a whole different set of behaviors, but it's motivated with the addiction to power and control and the abuse of power. And I've seen that happen with a lot of Reformed people. And you want to see some crazy, go to Celebrate Recovery. I've talked to a lot of Christians over a year now. I've just been drawn to them. And a lot of times they're singing the praises of Celebrate Recovery. You can't say anything bad about them. They're like this Christian-based 12-step group, which is funny because the 12 steps were based on the Bible anyways. And they talk about all of these testimonies, and people stand up and they talk about all this stuff that they're delivered from. They haven't had a drop of alcohol in 2 weeks or 2 months, and yay, and everybody claps, and then they disappear for a couple months, and they come back and they're crying, help me, help me, help me. And the next thing you know, a year later, they're putting them in charge, and they're telling people what to do, and they're just in this power trip. And AA is a very toxic place. If you know anything about 12-step recovery groups, they're really healthy in a way to get people off of these very, very destructive paths that they're going on. It's just that when folks spend decades in 12-step groups, they really have some thinking that you get around them, and it's like they just keep repeating these same things again. There's a lot of crazy with 12-step people. I wish there was healthier ways of doing recovery that is really recognized by a lot of mainstream stuff. And we're rethinking recovery too. I think we're doing more inclusion and more empowering and stuff, but it's not very empowering. And so what happens is that people go from one extreme to a faith context that is extreme. And they get into this, what I was abstaining from a lot of things, and I succeeded at it. And it's kind of embarrassing to talk about this though, but for lack of a better term, I didn't get myself off for 12 months. And I don't know any guy who's ever done that as an adult. I was in my mid-20s at the time. And that's how devoted my life was. And there was a lot of power when it came to channeling this biblical thing and this kingdom that was trying to use me to establish this stuff on earth to influence people and to build this ideology and this thing that's being written on people's minds and in the media and all the Bible influence and stuff. I was such a big part of that for so long. And then I started to compartmentalize my life. And that's when the crazy really started. And when I got around these Celebrate Recovery groups, and there was a splinter group too, that took the Celebrate Recovery principles of listening to, you could give feedback, negative feedback, tell people what to do right there in a group setting. You could ask some loaded questions, you could humiliate them, you could be abusive, and it was okay. And then I went to straight camp, and then it was just even worse like that too. And so it's amazing how they're trying to say we need less sex, but more violence. Sex is bad, abuse, trying to control people and yelling at them and humiliating them. Well, that's okay. And that's a whole lot of crazy, because I tell you, when it comes to sex and violence, I've had a lot more harm with violence than I've had with sex. And I've gotten some diseases in my life, and I've gotten some heartache in my life. And still, I've had a pretty healthy sex life since my early 30s. And some of it's been harmful and some of it hasn't been. And I'm living a life right now where I'm partnered and monogamous, and it's great. I mean, that could change any second now, but I love it. And it's wonderful to express my sexuality in the context of a loving relationship. And a lot of LGBTQ people don't quite have that. And it took me a long time to reconcile that because of all the culture and all the programming that I had, that sex had to be not only in a marriage context, but between a man and a woman. And from a psychological standpoint, that's a whole nother form of crazy as well. But what happens is that, and this is a great example. Okay, so I couldn't find a specific conversion therapy, reparative therapy, anti-gay therapy, ex-gay therapy, whatever you want to call it, in Anchorage, Alaska, which I'm not surprised because it wasn't a very big city. But there was a guy from there in the mid-'80s who had this testimony of him getting AIDS, and he had pamphlets and stuff, and he was on the radio and television. Well, he moved out of state, and he had this huge ministry that he had coast-to-coast offices. He had an East Coast office and a West Coast office, and I would call this woman. She was like a counselor. I remember one of the things she's told me, she says, when it comes to homosexuality, she said, it's a closed door. And I said, yeah, it's a closed door. Yeah, you're right. Amen. Let's pray. And then I got counseling from some other splinter groups and parachurch groups and church groups and recovery groups and stuff like that. I had 5 years of that. And I found out that this guy who ran this big coast-to-coast ministry had just disappeared, and I couldn't get through to the office. And I just thought, okay, I guess they closed it down for a little bit. So anyways, my partner's calling. Speaking of him, I better get this. Hey, sweetie, what's up? You might as well, and then I'll just have a huge couple of smoothies in the next day or two. You might as well get because I haven't opened the ones from last week, but I could sure use them. Okay. And that's the spinach and the greens together, right? Spinach and spring mix. Yeah, there you go. Okay, thank you, honey. Once I do it, I remember. You're awesome. Love you big. Okay. Alrighty, bye-bye. Oh, yes. You really hungry? I could eat very soon, yes. Uh-huh. They have gluten-free crust. They have gluten-free crust. Could you get me some gluten-free pizza? I could do that. Ah, thank you so much. I've been craving that for so long. Okay. I checked out their website. They said they had it. Uh-huh. Okay. I'll call them and see, so it'll be kind of on the ready. Okay. Awesome. Is it? Okay. All right. We'll see you soon. All right. Bye-bye. Alrighty. Bye-bye. Anyways, back to what I was saying, compartmentalization is such a form of insanity. In fact, I want to check this thing here. Yeah, I'm still recording. Look at that. So this ministry that I was calling disappears. Well, when I went to straight camp, and this was just months after this happened, guess who was there? That ex-gay leader was there because he was having not only sex with men during the time when he was running this coast-to-coast ministry of telling his testimony how he's free from homosexuality and all this stuff, is that he was boning guys. Not only that, but unprotected sex, and not even revealing his HIV status to guys. So that's a good example of compartmentalization. And this is one of the best examples I have of compartmentalization because I saw it all around me. So I'm calling this ex-gay therapy, getting counseling from somebody out of state, and then they disappear for some reason. Couldn't figure it out. And then several months later, I go to an actual straight camp out of state, a residential recovery program for men dealing with sexual issues. A lot of us were gay and bi that were there. And guess who's there but Michael Johnston, the guy from Anchorage who had Caruso Ministries, and the ministry folded because he was outed. Somebody recognized him at a gay bar or something like that, tried to get a picture of him. I think that was the same story. But anyways, so it wasn't just that he had a weak moment and that he was preaching against homosexuality and then ends up at a gay bar and has a weak moment. No, I mean, this guy went to a total extreme where he's having unprotected sex with guys and he's not even telling them his HIV status, putting himself and others in danger. And that's how compartmentalization works. It is a Jekyll and Hyde type disorder where somebody has a form of dissociative identity disorder. They might not necessarily become totally unconscious, but in their mind they're thinking, hey, I've abstained from this for days, weeks, months, years, maybe decades, and I just can't do it anymore. Or maybe there's a mental health issue or another crisis or something, and they lose that ability to live that chaste life. And in doing that, like Ted Haggard, for instance, he's like not only going to have sex with a man, but he decides to have a rent-a-boy and get some meth at the same time. Because what happens is that when people believe that, well, sin is sin, God will forgive, your sin, whether you're exceeding the speed limit or whether you're raping a child, it's all sin in God's eyes, and he will forgive all of that. And there's a mentality that the consequences in the world, which I know that on a conscious level, they think there's a lot more consequences when you're destroying the life of a young person than there is just taking an extra item into the express lane. What happens is that when you get around this God will forget everything kind of a thing, there's nothing really necessarily wrong with that, except for the fact that people start to view things that are a tiny bit harmful as being the same as something that's extremely harmful, or not even harmful at all. And so if I was Ted Haggard, and he had this mega church there, and he was even quoted as saying, if you believe something is wrong, don't do it, to that extent. And he was on Oprah. This was back about 11, 12 years ago. And this was about the time that I was starting to do activism when it came to speaking out about my anti-gay experience and stuff like that. Is if I was Ted Haggard, I would have said, wife, this is probably going to end our relationship, but I do want to say something. I am bisexual, and I would love it if we can open our relationship. And I would like to go to a gay church and find a nice single Christian man or a man in an open relationship and allow him into our home, or allow me to visit him, and we'll have protected sex, and I will be careful. And there are men that do that, but I tell you, I have met so many, especially closeted guys and married guys. And believe me, I'm not proud of this though, but I've been with some married guys over the years. And after I get to talk to these guys, they don't even ask their wives, and their wives might even know, and they might even know that they know, or they typically don't know that they know. And then of course the cliche is the wives always know. Just watch House Hunters and you get this guy saying, oh, I want pink drapes, and the wife is going, okay, yeah. And so what happens is that when it comes to compartmentalization, when somebody is living one life and believing the same thing, and then occasionally they have this other thing where something else takes over, where their brain just switches from one source of control, where their will is completely run and governed by something else that's making them choose things that they believe that are wrong or that really are harmful. And that is a huge form of crazy. In fact, we call that sociopaths and psychopaths and split personalities and things like that. When somebody has suddenly, they're talking different, they're acting different, they're like a whole different person. You're like, oh my God. I mean, I've known people like this where suddenly something happens and they have a whole different set of memories and they have a whole different set of behaviors. They're like a different person, but it's the same body. And they're doing everything. They're saying that they shouldn't do this, and suddenly, boom, they're doing it. And then they stop, and then it's like it never happened. And they start to program themselves. So this started happening to me, where I came back from a funeral thousands of miles away, and I was just broken, and the church wasn't there for me, and then it was just a horrible experience. And it was like, okay, this church thing is really starting to fall apart. This is not a safe world for me. And I can't restrain this heterosexual, asexual thing that I've been doing for 10 years. And I hooked up with a couple of guys. But right away, though, I'm telling people, I'm crying at the altar, I'm wanting to change, I'm doing all this. And they accepted me. However, slowly, over a period of about a year or two, they were demoting me. So the first thing is I can't preach, of course. And the second thing is I can't lead worship, but I can be on the worship team. And then after a while, I can't be on the worship team, but I can attend church. And then after a while, they're not going to want me around that church. But it never got that far because I could see where things were going. And I was like, okay, so here it is. I'm becoming a better musician, getting more experience, and I'm honest about my life. And I see all these other worship leaders, and they're living this compartmentalized thing where they're lying about it. And I knew that, well, not only that, though, low-functioning mentally ill people have a hard time keeping up this compartmentalized thing because it really does fuck with your mind. It drives you literally insane if you keep doing one thing and saying another and believing another thing. It really messes with people. And if you live with other disorders like mood disorders and stuff like that, a compartmentalized life will just lead you to suicide. And that's what happens for people that just can't keep up that facade. And I mean, there are guys that, you know, lie to their wives and children and churches and congregations and everything like that. And they've been boning guys for years and years and years. And there was a divorced guy I used to hook up with, and he was one of the leaders in a volunteer position at a mega church. And he would lie to me about all these other things too. And it was just so weird that this guy was so respected, and this was a church where the Spirit was moving and the worship was wonderful and all this kind of stuff. And here one of the head guys. And so there's a big church, and one of the main volunteers is hiring a guy from out of state to have unprotected sex with him, and he was so irresponsible. In fact, he even had a mini stroke, actually a pretty big mini stroke, because he was taking Cialis or Viagra or something like that, and his system couldn't handle it. I think he was overdosing on it and stuff like that. And he's bending over for guys and barebacking this erotic massage guy out of state and all that kind of stuff. And it's so sad that so I've been very close to a lot of men, and there are some women too, but I'm just talking mostly about the insanity with men because that's what I've been exposed to so much, is guys that just cannot live this life, and they're either going to come clean about it, or they're going to live in secret and wait for them to be exposed, or they live in secret their whole lives and nobody ever knows about it. And what's so sad is, and I was exposed to this lately when I came out to Central Oregon, and I wanted to do music for a church here. And the first church I went to, I saw there was a missing instrument, and I brought it to practice one time. And then they all left early, and I talked to the pastors, and of course they wanted to interrogate me about my church background and everything, and I talked about it, but I said, you know, I haven't been following the Bible for 5 years, and I don't go to church anymore. And there's a lot of things in my life that you guys wouldn't agree with. I didn't go into detail. They didn't ask me, though, but it would have been funny if they said, well, what? And I said, well, just today, I had gay sex, weed, and Eastern religious practices. We didn't even get that far. But the funny thing was that of course, they wanted me to attend their church and influence me and say they were praying for me to do this and that. And they also mentioned, they mentioned it by name. There was a guy in the worship team that they thought was living in sin or whatever, and they allowed him to. And then I thought, well, that's really weird, because, you know, they're talking about him the same way they're talking about me, as somebody who's not following all the rules and not being able to play in their worship team. But I thought about it. This guy was, quote, repentant. He knew it was wrong, and he's probably trying to work on it. And that's the whole thing, is that just as long as somebody thinks something is wrong, and if they do wrong, and if they repent before they die, which some doctrine actually enables that type of thinking, that they're going to be okay. And it's not okay. Because if you're doing something that's not harmful and you think it's wrong and you keep doing it, that's going to mess with your head, because you're going to live with this guilty conscience, and you're going to have to work it out in your head. And there's always something logical going on that, I think this is wrong, but it's not wrong. And how do you work that out? And then there's the fact that there are things that are harmful, stuff that is really, really harmful that people do, that they think, well, God will forgive me and all that kind of stuff. And that's a weird thing about grace too, is that this whole idea that you're not supposed to sin, but if you do, you won't have any spiritual consequences thing. I mean, that sounds like a good thing to live with. And at the same time, though, that's a lot of crazy as well. And there are so many things, especially when it comes to dealing with being born in sin, and that the earth is this cursed place, and that the world is evil. Well, the world system might be evil, but the earth itself, I don't think is evil. I don't think people are born evil, and they have to have something in from the outside that they have to obey for the rest of their life. And hearing voices, and hearing a voice that has to agree with all these writings that were hundreds and thousands of years old, and there's just so much crazy that finally I did this teaching at this Bible study thing, and I came out of there thinking, I'm really trying to convince myself and everybody not to be a Christian anymore, because I looked at the fundamentals of Christianity, whether they're liberal theology, even some of that stuff was toxic. Even though it came from a intellectual, practical type perspective, there was still a lot of things about those forms of Christianity, especially the fact that they're taking a very intense, very dangerous set of doctrines and watering it down and making it so it really wasn't that effective. It also wasn't as toxic. Is it when you have this belief that you got to preach to everybody or they're going to have eternal punishment? Well, you take that out of the context and you get around liberals, and they're more into social justice and all the tree hugging stuff that I love. And then you're preaching this Bible from that perspective, and there's so much of it that's contradicting their liberal politics and theology and all this kind of stuff, that they just have to keep watering it down until it's really nothing like Christianity anymore. And then it's kind of funny that they call themselves forms of Christianity. I used to work with churches like the United Church of Christ, or they call some of them Unitarians considering Christ. And there's a lot of crazy there too, because they're trying to practice a religion and turning it into something that resembles more like an Eastern religion. And one of the biggest crazies that there is just monotheism in itself. And we've seen this because we have all these religions with hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, and then occasionally somebody comes up and wants to take everybody over. And when people started staying put and started farming and all this kind of stuff, especially when they started writing stuff down later on, you get these people that were coming in and saying, all your gods are wrong. My God is the one who created the whole universe and has a big set of rules and who's bigger than any of your other gods, and all your gods are evil and you got to put them away. And it's not to say that all monotheism is like that. You got the Zoroastrians, and then you got the Hindus that got Brahma, and then you got the Native American people, they got the Great Spirit. But I mean, when you got folks that say, hey, there's this one invisible God, and you have to obey this one, and it's a male, and he's got like human characteristics. A lot of them are very narcissistic characteristics, and you got to obey this deity and all this kind of stuff. And it really becomes, so there's a lot of different ways that the Christian faith can resemble disorders and symptoms, but especially when somebody has a mentality that you're born not as this perfect baby with a clean slate, that they take a scripture like David saying he was born in sin, which if you look at his his background, that could have very well been the case in a specific setting. And then people take that to say, well, we're all born with this nature that is going to go against this kingdom that's trying to infiltrate this earth. But they think that they have no choice. They think that this voice that wrote all these words and influenced all these people, that is one deity that created everybody, that wants that much control over everybody's mind, and then pretends that it's a free gift. It's a free gift. Salvation's a free gift. And then it will cost you everything. And if you don't give it everything, then folks will question your devotion. And that is a big form of insanity, because most people aren't giving their faith 100%, especially some of these guys locally that I meet that are just a part of a Christian culture where they believe in this right or wrong thing, and they fear this deity, and they don't follow it. And it really is a form of insanity. And another thing too here, which I find interesting, that a lot of Bible believers want to quote this. And here's a website called Quote Investigator. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. These words are usually credited to the acclaimed genius Albert Einstein. There is no substantive evidence that Einstein wrote or spoke the statement above. But it's not only crazy to quote somebody, you got really no evidence that he ever said that. It's also funny that you get people that just keep praying for your healing, just keep believing God and keep believing God, whether they're resisting conventional natural health care. I mean natural, I mean like a non-spiritual thing, like going to the doctor or getting your vaccinations or whatever it is that people think that they need to believe God for. And I've been in some circles where they're against going to doctors, but that's pretty rare. People that believe in supernatural and divine healing, it's pretty rare that they will deny doctors, because they have a little more common sense these days, and they think, well, you know, doctors are trying to heal people and God's trying to heal people. It's all the same thing. At the same time, though, I did not get a lot of health care because I couldn't afford it, and I relied on faith way too much, and I resisted access to clinical mental health. And there was definitely a trend that, well, okay, you go see a doctor. If your appendix breaks, you don't want to pray for a miracle unless, you know, you do that first and, you know, God does it, or God tells you to do that. And that's another thing too, is that hearing voices, especially hearing the voice of God, that's a lot of crazy that you see in mental hospitals, that you see preachers on TV saying, God told me this and God told me that. and in some churches it's encouraged to say, well, what's God telling you? Or how much money is God telling you to give? And there's a lot of hypnotic suggestion when it comes to that. Even when you know, Benny Hinn one time told us to give $40, and that was all the money I had. Yeah, that's a lot of crazy in that too. So it is funny though that people that say keep praying and believing, or believe you have it now, like the Word of Faith people that I was around, and you keep doing this. And there was one thing I learned in straight camp, you know, that if you're pounding at a rock, there's microfractures, and you can't see the microfractures, but you just keep pounding it, and then you can't see what's going on, but something's happening, and then eventually poof, the rock breaks. Well, it happened. I kept pounding at this thing and nothing happened. In fact, nothing was happening to really anybody there. And if you get around these ex-gay testimonies and you really research them and give them enough time, and you meet these people and talk to them, you'll find there are very few cases where somebody stopped homosexual behavior for an extended period of time and actually had a healthy life. And I think that there probably are some exceptions, but the main thing is that people are doing this stuff and expecting a different result, and they're doing it over and over and over again. They're going from one program to another. This recovery program, I still like the same sex, and they go to another one. And I had to get out of that, because it took me a suicide attempt to realize that this is a lot of crazy. And it's not just me that's crazy, but it's my faith that was driving me to insanity. And that's really hard, because when people believe that there's one way to do something and that I don't get to choose my God, what if you could choose your faith? What kind of faith would you have if you started from a clean slate and challenged your Bible beliefs and dared to do that? Because so many people are so afraid to, because they see the Bible is the only one truth and that God is the only true God. And it's terrifying to think that somebody could ever challenge that and walk away from it. And I did, and it was very hard. It took me a long time. And I think if I did it all at once, I would have probably jumped off the deep end as far as this compartmentalization mentality that I had, and thinking that I was born in this sort of broken, sinful, godless sort of thing, and that was my default mode, and that if I was going to commit some sin, whether it was harmful or harmless, that it was going to be whatever the fuck I want. If I don't have God in my life, it's this other extreme. So it's either I've got God, or no God, and doing horrible, horrible, crazy shit that's harmful to me and putting others at risk, and some of it not necessarily being harmful at all. But there's this thing where our conscience is dependent on something external and something apart from logic, and that is a real form of crazy. He just keeps calling. Hi, honey.
Hey, they're closed for remodeling.
Oh, they are? Okay. Well, why don't you just come over and I'll fix you some lunch or something, or if you want to,
Just stop at the thrift store and find something.
yeah, just find something for you. I'll eat something for me, and maybe we'll grill some burgers or something.
Okay.
Okay. I appreciate you trying. Okay. See ya.
Yeah, alright, bye-bye.
Okay. So compartmentalizing your life and having this Jekyll and Hyde sort of split personality is so common, especially among men when it comes to Bible believers and among leadership. And it's so common that when we start to see something over and over and over again, no matter how crazy it is, no matter how much it contradicts what we're saying and what we say about ourselves, they will start to enable that behavior. It'll start to become the normal. And what happens when kids grow up in that thing and they see one thing and they hear another, that it starts to make them in a form of crazy. And what happens is that there's so much emphasis on, well, this is right and this is wrong. And then what happens is they don't know right from wrong, because they've got a system of right and wrong that's being imposed on them with fear and manipulation and a lot of crazy psychology and a lot of abuse. And then what happens is that if they try to find out what really matters in their life on a logical basis of what is harmful, what is not harmful, it's really hard to find that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad that I acclimated for almost a decade, reintroducing things and having to change. Okay, is this harmful? How harmful is it? And how do I adjust my belief system if I can, and if that's healthy and okay, to say, well, this is what the Bible people say, and this is what I'm doing, and how harmful is it to myself and my relationships? And it's harmful to my faith. And I had to either change my faith, change my belief systems, or change my life. But one thing I'm really grateful that I didn't do for long periods of time, I mean, it was no more than a week or two of believing one thing and doing another, is that I am telling somebody in leadership or whatever, hey, you want me to play at this worship conference? This is what I've been doing in my life that's wrong, and I'm changing it, and I want to tell you because I don't want to hold any secrets from you. And people were really shocked about that, because most people weren't that honest and transparent. It's not that I was a really good person or not. I mean, this was all part of my crazy. It's just the fact that I could not live a compartmentalized life because I had enough crazy. I had a lot of depression. I had a lot of mania. And trying to live a double life at the same time was impossible for somebody like that. And that leads me to something else too, is when you go to a religion that's full of a lot of crazy, and you go in there and you're crazy, is what type of environment is that? And the funny thing about mentally ill people and Bible culture is that, like I said, when it came to not being able to talk and act right amongst educated, professional, high-functioning progressives, I was an outcast from that society. And I found that Bible people could handle my crazy because they were all a little nutty, and they were all kind of outcast in one way or another because of their faith, is that I found they were very tolerant of my politically incorrect behavior and my social weirdness and all that kind of stuff. Because, you know, especially amongst full gospel people, we were all a little eccentric anyways. And so it was so ironic that here they are, they're really against me being gay, but they were okay with my crazy. In fact, they would allow me around children, whether they knew I was officially, you know, mentally ill or not. The moment I come out as gay, they don't want me around their kids, as if gays are pedophiles. And so what happens is that these mentalities that some high-functioning people can handle are really toxic to those with mental illness. And what's really difficult is the fact that a lot of mentally ill people are drawn to, especially full gospel circles. They like the tight-knit communities, they like the family-oriented environment, and they like people that aren't afraid of people that have different kinds of antisocial behavior, because a lot of people of faith exhibit a lot of antisocial behavior, which I think is really interesting. And that's a whole nother subject as well. It's just that one of the tough challenges is that churches can be one of the only places that mentally ill people can feel accepted, and they could enable a lot of crazy. And what happens is you get a mentally ill person and they're compartmentalizing their life. They're seeing one thing and doing another. They're hearing voices. They're, you know, spending their last dime. They're doing all these things that aren't practical. They're giving too much stuff away, or whatever it is. And a lot of churches will enable that kind of behavior. And it's sad because there's some things that a lot of higher functioning people can do that kind of stuff and it won't ruin their lives. And there's a lot of people that will come into the church and they will be encouraged to avoid mental health care, and they will seek pastoral counseling, and they will get a lot of advice that is from a non-clinical, uneducated perspective that knows very little or nothing about mental cognitive disorders, especially about things that really need clinical care. And you get people that are broken and really messed up that get more broken because of this, but because it's a solid family environment. And another thing that happens is that people feel safe, and they also may not necessarily feel trapped, but in a way they are, because they're scared to leave that environment. And so a lot of mentally ill people get worse when they're in those church environments, but they get kind of stuck in this thing when they get this dangerous mentality, and whether it destroys their life or not, they're suffering a lot living in a community that's doing one thing, that's saying another thing, that's getting them to enable, and it's enabling them to do behaviors that somebody with a mental health background would say, hey, this is harmful. And that's why I wish there were ways that when people find a church, and when they're interested in any kind of faith, that they were to say, hey, I'm not going to wait for someone to say, this is the truth, this is the way it is. I'm going to find out what's helpful and what's harmful. And if you are in a faith that says you're free, or that this has set you free, you should have the freedom to make a choice about what you believe, what is healthy, what works, and to have the courage to reject everything and anything that might do your life or anybody else any kind of harm.